So if you also put fava beans among your vegetables, or if you grow the three sisters, corn, squash and beans, or if you plant caragana or alder among your fruit trees, assuming all these nitrogen fixes will feed your crops might be entirely wrong. And yes, nitrogen fixes might not be that amazing after all. New episode of Useless Stuff. Today we're going to bash nitrogen fixers. But as usual, the idea isn't just to say that it's useless, otherwise I wouldn't make a video about it. Nitrogen fixers have a real role to play, otherwise they would have disappeared a long time ago. However, just like with all the other topics in this series, there are a lot of misconceptions about them. And today we're going to try to clear all that up. Alright, in this video we're going to see exactly what nitrogen fixers are, how to use them in the garden, and most importantly, do we really need them for our crops? And if you answered yes or no to that last question, maybe you should watch this video because the answer isn't exactly that simple. Alright, so first, what exactly are nitrogen fixing plants? And as usual, we'll try to go through the theory pretty quickly. So basically, they can be legumes, clovers, alfalfa, fava beans or field beans. When it's for green manure or for slightly bigger plants, it can be honey locusts, caragana, bagonodiers, black locusts or false acacias. Or it can be plants from another family than legumes like alders, elaeagnus or sea buckthorn. Basically, these are plants that will fix nitrogen gas from the air. They will establish symbiosis at their roots with bacteria. And these bacteria know how to fix nitrogen gas from the air to turn it into organic nitrogen. So nitrogen, it's not the only element that plants need, but it's still a very important element for their fertility. So basically, nitrogen fixing plants are plants that, starting from nothing, from the nitrogen that's in the air, so almost from nothing, will build fertility. We could also say these nitrogen fixing plants don't need fertilizer from us, since they associate with bacteria that supply it instead. Be careful here, as there are already many misconceptions about what I just said. The first thing to know is that the bacteria living in symbiosis with these plants are found in the roots, in special organs called nodules. Here, I'll put a little picture somewhere here so you can see what it looks like. So these bacteria fix nitrogen from the air, but from the air in the soil. So for this to work, the soil needs to be aerated and structured, and on compacted soil, it will be much less effective. The second thing to know is that these bacteria produce organic nitrogen, which is fertilizer for the plant. But this fertilizer, they don't just give it away, they exchange it for something else. And that something else is sugar that the plant produces through photosynthesis. So the plant gets this nutrient, but not for free, it buys it with sugar. And what if this nitrogen-fixing plant grows in fertile soil, where it can have direct access to nitrogen? The plant will save resources by taking nitrogen directly from the soil instead of buying it from bacteria. This is important for what we'll see next. And the last big common misconception is that the nitrogen-sugar exchange happens at the level of the plant. Nitrogen is not directly redistributed to the soil or to the surrounding plants. The plant buys nitrogen from its bacteria, but it uses it for itself and doesn't redistribute it directly around itself. For me, this understanding could change how we view nitrogen-fixing plants. Now that we know the plant doesn't redistribute nitrogen around it, we might think that's useless, but it's not. Now let's see how it works and how we could use them intelligently in the garden. In nature, nitrogen-fixing plants are often present, but not everywhere, and not in a uniform way. They will mostly be found on poor soils, on land that is not very fertile and not very vegetated. They will mostly be present in the early stages, as the land starts to revegetate. Basically, they will be there to fertilize the land during the first years and once the land has become fertile and well vegetated. The nitrogen-fixing plants won't necessarily disappear, but in any case, they will greatly reduce their presence, and above all, they will make room for others that need more fertile soil to settle in. That already shows us how we might use them today. And the first thing it tells us is that if you already have soil that's quite fertile, if you're setting up your garden in a place that's already rich, with lots of things growing, you don't necessarily need to add any, or at least not much. Or only plant the crops you want to harvest, grow legumes, grow peas, fava beans, things like that to harvest them, or Siberian pea shrub to eat its fruits. But otherwise, there's no need to add too much on soil that's already well established. On the other hand, if you're starting on land that's relatively poor, with soil that's not very fertile, then you'll need to add some. Anyway, it could be interesting to add some, but only at the beginning. And then, once your soil is well established and fertile, which means after a few years there will be less need for it. Above all, it's less worthwhile to add it, since fertile soil means nitrogen-fixing plants may not form a symbiosis with bacteria. At that point, it no longer makes sense. So, if you're planning your forest garden in the long term, there's no need to keep a third of the space for nitrogen fixers just to make sure your fruit trees are well nourished. However, you will still need to add some at the beginning, and here's how I would generally do it. We're going to plant nitrogen-fixing trees, maybe reserve a third of the space for nitrogen-fixing trees. Do these nitrogen-fixing trees, with the help of bacteria, produce nitrogen just for themselves? And you're going to prune them, pollard them, collect branches and leaves that you'll leave on the ground to further boost those trees' growth. Then you'll prune them again afterwards. And the idea is to make them produce organic matter to put it on the ground where it will decompose. Well, that's going to bring fertility and various elements, including but not just nitrogen. I focus on nitrogen, but it's not the only one. And so these plants in this way will fertilize the soil. So you have your pollarded trees that you regularly prune in the garden or even around the edges of the garden, and you fertilize the soil. And later, once your soil is fertile, you can almost completely remove the nitrogen-fixing trees from the forest garden. That way you free up all the space and keep all the sunlight for your fruit trees. At that stage, they don't need much nitrogen. It's mostly needed at initial planting. But once the trees are well developed, they need a diverse supply of fertilizing materials and therefore organic matter in the soil. And this supply can come from plants that grow under the trees. We can keep bushes, we can keep ground covers, and with these plants, it's not mandatory. That there are a lot of nitrogen fixers, there can be a few, but it's what matters is having a diverse mix, lots of different types of plants. Covering the soil ensures a steady supply of organic matter. Once that's achieved and the soil is fertile, nitrogen-fixing plants become less important. Another example, if you're starting on poor soil, another way to do it could be to just bring in organic matter directly, like mulch, green waste, or compost, for example. And if you do it that way, there's no need at all for nitrogen fixers anymore, since the role of nitrogen fixers is to produce that organic matter. In fact, you even save time by directly adding green waste mulch. Well, on the other hand, I'm not saying that's the way you have to do it. If you do that, you're dependent on an external supply and you'll have to find it, maybe even buy that external supply of green waste. And that's why it's often more interesting to plant nitrogen-fixing plants. It's more natural, it's cheaper, but it takes longer. However, be careful, there is still something that could be completely illogical and not cost-effective, not interesting at all. That would be bringing in organic matter, bringing in shredded material, green waste, compost. And in that, planting nitrogen fixers or sowing a green manure, a mix of plants to fertilize the soil with a lot of legumes in that green manure. If you do that in a soil that has been fertilized, that has been fed with compost, like I said, the plants, if they find nitrogen directly in the soil, they don't form symbiosis. So fully fertilizing the soil and putting nitrogen fixers in it doesn't make sense at all. What you can do, on the other hand, and which is actually effective, is to start by loosening the soil well. Once you have loosened your soil well, you put a small layer of compost. Eventually, it will improve the germination of your green manure, but here, you shouldn't put too much, just a small layer of compost. Sowing green manure will help it get off to a good start, and then you let your green manure develop well. And once it's well developed, do you mow it and lay it on the ground, or do you just lay it on the ground directly? So, I've made plenty of videos about green manure. I'll put a link up here. Go check it out to see in more detail how to proceed once you've laid your green manure on the ground. At this stage, you can add compost, shredded material, mulch, or other organic matter. Ça va être encore more fertility. Now your soil will be much more fertile later, partly due to the nitrogen-fixing plants you added before. But what's important is to add the compost after growing green manure crops, not before, otherwise it's not as effective. Alright, if all of this still isn't perfectly clear, let's finish with the story of the three sisters. You know, the three sisters, that's the combination. Corn, squash, beans. We have corn that grows tall, squash that spreads along the ground and also plays the role of covering the soil. On the other hand, squash is demanding, it needs nitrogen, and that's where we add a bean. So a nitrogen-fixing legume that climbs, which will climb up the corn and will fix nitrogen from the air, and so it produces fertility to feed the squash. If you've been following along, you know it doesn't work that way, does it? That part about feeding the squash is a common misconception. However, this plant association is still a fairly common crop, a widely practiced method. And it works, but how does it work? Well, because this association isn't done just once, it's something we repeat year after year. And above all, at the end of each crop, the crop residues are returned to the soil. Corn, squash, and beans are all left on the ground to decompose, adding nitrogen to the soil. Gradually, the soil becomes increasingly fertile. It will become richer, but only thanks to the beans, since the squash and the corn will return their nitrogen to the soil. But this nitrogen was already taken by the plant from the soil. Of the three, only the bean can actually add new nitrogen to the soil. It's the bean. So, In a mixed crop like this, if the soil isn't necessarily very fertile, the bean will form root symbiosis and will add nitrogen. And at the end of the crop, when it decomposes, it will return this nitrogen to the soil, which will be available for the other plants. In the next crop, the plants will take up nitrogen from the soil and they will return it at the end of the crop. If you think about leaving the crop residues on the soil, and year after year, there will be more and more nitrogen thanks to the nitrogen fixing plant. Does that mean? So don't get discouraged if you try it the first year and then realize it isn't that fertile yet. You'll need to repeat this each year to gradually enrich the soil. And it also means that it's always extremely important to leave crop residues on the ground, otherwise you deplete your soil as you keep removing material. Alright, I hope all of this is a bit clearer now. Let me know in the comments if it's not clear enough, let me know. Do you use nitrogen fixing plants and how do you use them? And also let me know if you disagree, whether you completely disagree or just don't fully agree with everything I said in this video.
Like, all of this is nonsense. It's unbelievable to hear nonsense like that.
It's thanks to that I'm making progress, so let me know if you disagree. One last little bit of information. If you're looking for nitrogen fixing plants or trees, well, we sell them here at the nursery. We're open every Saturday afternoon. We're in Marsac-sur-Tarn, next to Albi. So there you go. If you're interested, or even if you just want to come and talk about it, well, come see us. We'd be happy. All right, thanks for sticking with me this far. If you enjoyed it, let us know in the comments. Give us a thumbs up, share the video with your friends. All that is great and really makes us happy. If you want to support me financially, I'll put a little link over here to the TP page, or just search for Le Jardin d'Emerveille on TP, and thank you very much. And then, happy gardening to everyone and see you soon. All right, bye.